Okay. Hello and welcome. I'm here with Jade Wright, self-described bogan by the ocean and person with a disorder of the corpus callosum. Just explain for us what a bogan by the ocean means. Let's start there.
A bogan is essentially a bit of a lower class citizen who is pretty rough and tumble, bit of a redneck. And of course the ocean is by which I live, and it rhymes. So
I love it. Is there a hierarchy in boganhood? Is it better to be a bogan by the ocean, or like, is there other kinds of
it's best to be a
bogans?
cashed up bogan. Best to be a cashed up bogan like Shane
Yeah.
Warne, or
Okay.
I guess Kath and Kim at this point, now that they're so successful, the actresses that did that.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Cool.
sort of western suburbs of Sydney, like, yeah.
Cool. How did you get diagnosed with a corpus callosum disorder?
Backtrack a little bit. I have conversion disorder, which is a psychological issue that's kind of like Tourette's, and we wanted to make sure that my tics and my jerking movements and things, we wanted to make sure that wasn't anything worse, like MS. So I got a MRI brain scan done, and the doctor goes, just so you know, everything's fine. No MS, you're all set in that regard. Oh, by the way, there's a part of your brain is missing. I went, what do you mean part of my brain is missing? He's like, yeah, don't worry about it. You've overcome it. It's fine. But just so you know, it's quite an interesting finding. Your corpus callosum is a lot smaller than it should be. And I didn't think much about it until maybe a year later, when I was still having the same symptoms, and thought, wow, maybe this is all connected. Maybe he didn't quite know as much about the disorder as he thought he did. So I went searching on the internet and found a community of Australians, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I find a lot of connection with your story with my own and some of the other stuff that I've heard. How old were you when this happened, the MRI?
I was 21 at the time.
Yeah. So you've got
on my whole childhood. Without knowing that I different. Well, I sort of felt in myself that I was different, but I had no basis for that. Thought.
I think a lot of people feel similar, and then they get that diagnosis by looking at something else that's going on in their life, and then they're told that it doesn't matter because they've managed, and then you go through this really hard journey of like trying to figure out what the relationship is between having the corpus callosum disorder stuff and the person that you are and the challenges that you have. So how long had you had what was it called? The conversion
disorder.
Okay.
I've had a lot of mental health issues on and off since I was about 18. But this conversion disorder stuff was quite new at the time. I think I'd had it maybe 6 to 8 months by the time I got the scan done. It's still pervasive at this point. Still getting symptoms, but not as bad as it used to be. I'm quite a lot more adept at managing those symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. So where does having you've got hyperplasia of the corpus callosum,
yes,
where does that fit in your life with all the other parts of your journey? What does it mean to you to have a corpus callosum disorder?
That's a very interesting question. For a long time, I assumed that a lot of my issues, because I've had trouble holding down a job, some social issues, things like that, and for a long time I thought that was my fault. In that kind of way that a lot of people feel like their depression is their fault. And even though I'd had all these diagnoses of OCD and other things that should have theoretically told me that, no, it's not you, it's this disorder, it's a lack of chemicals or whatever, it just wasn't really enough, I don't think, to convince me that it wasn't just a failing of mine. So when I was diagnosed with this missing brain chunk, essentially, that would never grow back, it was definitely a shift, because I had to start thinking about sort of what recovery looks like if it's not exactly as the doctors say. Then where do I sit? in the realm between able-bodied and disabled, and neurotypical and not.
Yeah, I relate to that quite a bit. The moralizing of our problems in the context of mental health. I think we want, to a degree, for our problems to be moral ones, and the broader society that we're in influences us in that way as well. And I think, I don't know if you relate to this, but I feel like focusing on moral solutions for problems that aren't moral ones doesn't solve the problem. Like, of course, it's not going to.
Absolutely.
So putting all our...
I mean, we like to moralize, I think, because we prefer to have someone to blame, rather than just saying, oh, it was a random roll of the dice when you were 12 weeks old in the womb, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's that lack of control there that really doesn't sit well.
Yeah. And has that you've had a shift in the way that you think about who you are and the challenges that you've had. So how has that impacted the mental health side of your story?
It's meant that I've been a lot more open, I think, to trying a few different things, and like positive psychology especially. I had a lot of it just didn't sit well with me. It didn't seem like something that could help in any regard. But I think having tried everything else, and knowing that people with ACC have, recurring anxiety issues and things, was enough to make me think that think of things as more of from a management perspective than a necessary recovery, cured, sick than not kind of binary system.
Yes. Yeah. So what you mentioned, positive psychology. What is that? How would you?
Positive psychology focuses a lot on self-compassion, a lot on mindfulness, and trying to combat the thoughts in your mind that are quite negative, that say, oh, I'm useless, I'm an idiot, and challenging those thoughts in a was it started in CBT? Probably.
I would tend to think so. A lot of that sort of stuff has come from that background in my limited knowledge, and I'm sort of biased towards a lot of the CBT stuff, which I'm very much challenging as I talk to more and more people with Corpus Callosum Disorders, and they're coming from experiences outside of not only CBT but psychology in general. And medical model stuff. That's also my background and my bias and where I'm coming from and where I want to challenge. What has been the best thing for you in overcoming the challenges that you have? And I guess I want to know, like, the impacts on your life and what's happened, and then where it's led. What's been the best stuff that's been most helpful?
Okay. I think for a long time I've sort of been in the gray area between, being sick, being healthy, being disabled, being able-bodied, and a lot of resources and things sort of don't really fall in that area. So you might be able to get housing if you've got if you're a wheelchair user, but saying that sometimes you have balance issues and sometimes you don't, then that sort of episodic way can be quite challenging. And I think for a long time too, that made me doubt whether or not I even had any kind of disorders, or because it wasn't consistent. It wasn't something that I could check off a checklist in quite the way that you do with the DSM-5 and things, because everything sort of shifts around in the day. But I think the most helpful thing in this journey has been meeting other people with ACC, because, well, the conference that we went to a couple months ago was really fantastic in opening my eyes to the ways in which people with ACC have succeeded, and that it wasn't necessarily a barrier in what everyone wanted to do. It was it might have been a challenge or obstacle of some sort, but if you don't overcome any kind of obstacle in your life to do what you want and dream for, then are you really going to appreciate it as much as you would if you had all these other issues? So it's made me a bit more of a grateful person, I think, and more of a mindful person in sort of slowing down and having less of a goals-based, I'll get the car, I'll be happy, I'll get the house, I'll be happy, and more of a value kind of, values-based
life. Absolutely. That was a great answer to a really challenging question.
Thank you.
So when I see people do something that I want to do, it's sort of like, that's like a way for me to do it. I can look at that person do something and be like, oh, that's giving me ideas. So seeing people with a corpus callosum disorder do whatever, be successful or be happy or overcome challenges, is that what you're talking about? Is that mapping on to your experience, like just seeing how people live their lives?
Well, part of it is that representation, I guess, because for a long time I'd sort of heard it from a medical model that if you're missing a part of your brain, there's going to be extensive, profound disabilities. You might be non-verbal, you might not be able to walk and things like that, which is sometimes the case for people with ACC, but it's not always the case, and it wasn't the case with me. So I thought that maybe things were less severe for me, and so I should be able to overcome them faster, or all sorts of strange mental gymnastics that you go through. But that kind of cleared away when I met other people with ACC, and they sort of said, yeah, I have those same thoughts, but I have a doctorate, or I'm retired and I've been married for 40 years, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem to be really perspective changing, and I think we tend to undervalue that contribution that it makes to have community and connections in that way with people that relate to us where no one else can relate to us in that way. So if you had one thing, or maybe you've got more than one thing, that you want to say to not just the Corpus Callosum disability community, but like the world at large about Corpus Callosum disorders, advice about it, information about it, what can people know that's going to impact how people with corpus callosum disorders are treated? What's the big enchilada? What's the big piece of information that you want people to know?
Give me the kahunas, Jade.
Yeah.
The thing that popped up fastest to my mind when you were saying all those things and mentioning what people need to know, I think I was quite trapped in my idea of what recovery looks like, and what being disabled looks like, and what I had these expectations for my life that I wasn't meeting, and it was quite disheartening. But what I would say is that wherever you find joy, wherever you find something that relieves that pain, whether it's spiritual, medical. For a long time, I was trapped in that like psychology realm, and nothing else would do. Like I wouldn't try acupuncture. I wouldn't, see a rabbi or any of those sorts of things. But I think help comes in mysterious ways and from strange places. Often, if there's a sea breeze outside, I'll have the best day that I've had in weeks just because there's a nice breeze. So any kind of what am I trying to say? Lost some train of thought. Sorry. That's another thing though.
That was a great train of thought that you had. There's what I got out of it is that there's more to wellness and treatment than the medical model of disability and the biopsychosocial medical framework of healthcare. And that's something that I've been exposed to by being exposed to the disability community and by the corpus callosum disorder community, that there's more to the world than medicine. It has its framework and its realm and its good stuff. And healthcare is bigger than medicine. It's bigger than psychology. There's more stuff to it. There's different perspectives, and we don't get a wholeness of the experience of fixing our challenges by just focusing on psychology and medicine. There's more to it than that.
I've recently been trying to pick up a bit of a reading habit, or audiobooks, because I prefer those. I find it easier to concentrate when I'm listening. But I found that I was listening to a lot of nonfiction and a lot of self-help, just trying to white knuckle my way through and force this recovery upon myself. But stopping and maybe reading some fiction, that escapism has some value.
Yeah.
So yeah, just keep trying is what is my message, and try different things.
Yeah, yeah. I do love self-help, but I kind of get put off by the idea that it's an industry that needs to keep putting stuff out. I get that messages need to be packaged in different ways, but if it really worked, like, why is there so much of it? But at the same time, it doesn't stop me getting my teeth into a lot of those books and stuff. So based on what we've covered, I want to ask you what your definition of disability is. And the other word that I want to ask you about is recovery. What is the definition of recovery in your experience and perspective?
Right. What I originally thought recovery was returning to normal, returning to what I used to be like, because I was quite successful in high school, especially for someone with ACC, I think. And then things started to go downhill when I was diagnosed with OCD and things. And it felt like I'd lost myself, and recovery felt like getting back on that train and finding myself again. But when it comes to disability, it's sort of that acceptance that the train's been derailed, but there's no way to get back on the on the correct track, and that for all intents and purposes, you're on the right track, because it's the track that you're on, and there's a lot of acceptance that has to come with disability, and accepting that you might be in pain for a long time, you might have these challenges for the rest of your life, but that doesn't mean, that's not a limiting factor, I guess. Turning that around has been quite a formidable process for me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's an extraordinary value in acceptance, and it's not about giving up, which is what I always sort of thought of it as. It's about working with what you've got to get the best, because if you're fighting against it, you might not get anywhere. And there's so much value in acceptance in the way that you're talking about it, and so much power in it. You can work with what you've got to get somewhere, and accepting things that can't change perhaps is a foundation for going forward in a new way. So not going back to what you were before, like what you were saying, but
finding a new normal.
A new normal. Yeah, that's the word that I heard somebody say when they were diagnosed with a condition, and they just talked about it so plainly, just the way that you have. And that was my first exposure to acceptance as a positive concept, just being really open and plain about this new thing that they've got in their life, and there's a new normal. And I was like, oh, if they can say that and live that way, then maybe I can. And hearing you talk about it in that way reinforces that idea, and like, I've got this part of me that wants to be perfect and wants perfection in every facet of my life, and I don't want to give up on trying to change things that can't change. And so when I hear you say that sort of stuff, it's kind of like empowering, and because I know that you're very influential on the community, very articulate, and you've got some great ideas, and I've got to take them on board. And there's this theme running through the community, and it's like, if all of these people have this experience, then there's got to be some value to it. So some of the Corpus Callosum disorder community have visible disabilities and some are invisible. I tend to think of disability as a label that we can use on ourselves, although I know that disability has different definitions for different people. And I tend to think of visibility and invisibility as like what other people see us as. So it's something that we can't really choose. I would think of you as, if you thought of yourself as disabled, I don't know, but I think of Corpus Callosum Disorders as a disability, and then in that context, I would think of you as invisibly disabled. How do you feel about?
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah. Do you feel like Corpus Callosum Disorders are a disability?
Oh, that's a whole can of worms you've got there. I think thinking about the world in a different perspective, a different way, isn't necessarily at all a disability. It's an asset for sure, but that's not to say that disability and assets and being an asset aren't one and the same. Think of Helen Keller. Think of I mean, even Billie Eilish. She has Tourette's and she sings, and she's one of the greatest pop artists of probably our generation. Let's be real. That's a little bias on my point, but we'll let that slide, shall we? So I think that's a difficult question. I think the hardest part is something that a lot of racial experts will talk about is white people putting on blackness for a while, and this kind of cultural appropriation, and white people with dreadlocks listening to rap music, and then being able to take off the street clothes and things. Go to like a Thanksgiving with your racist aunt or whatever, and not have to face those consequences. And I feel a little bit like that in the disabled community, because it is invisible and I'm not in pain, thank goodness. So there's a lot of the disabled story that I don't identify with, because I just don't experience things like that. So it does make me feel a little bit like an outsider in both worlds. But yeah, I'm coming towards the idea of identifying myself as disabled. We'll see.
Yeah. I think it's entirely up to you. And I think it's entirely acceptable that there's multiple interpretations of what disability is. And I think language changes with time. And if it changes tomorrow, I'm going to update how I use my language to follow suit.
Right.
I think personally it's good and bad, and neither all at the same time. So it's a powerful word that I don't want to take away from other people, but at the same time, I'm happy to like use it in a way that's not negative and that sort of stuff. But I really like the way that you've described invisible disability. That's not a way that I've ever heard it described before. Yeah.
Just for context for the listeners, I'm a white woman, so anything I say about race is probably wildly incorrect. But this is just what I've heard from other people.
And yeah, I think that acknowledgement is great. I'm a white person as well, and we can't really talk about race because we don't experience racism. But you're not talking about racism as such. You're talking about a white experience where you get to indulge in what I interpreted, what you said is you get to put on Black culture as a thing. You get to borrow it without the negative consequences, the racism that comes with being in a Black body. And so you get to think that you're doing something cool and something like that, but you're not, you're exploiting the culture, and that's sort of what I've interpreted you saying. And we can't ever know what experiencing racism is like being white people. Yeah.
No. But there is that crossover with the disability community, I think. Because I can get up and walk out of here right now, and no one would necessarily know that I have bits missing or whatever else, and I'm not in pain. But a lot of people don't have that luxury.
Yeah. And I guess where invisible disability does have its challenges is that the invisibly disabled people aren't always able to meet expectations of being the able-bodied person that they're perceived to be.
That is true, yeah.
And then there's moralizing that comes with that, because you don't meet people's preconception of disability, therefore you have moral problems for why you are the way that you are. Yeah. And I think you don't fit into either space, and there's a bit of not being able to access help that you need, and help not being designed for you.
Yes.
That's sort of what I think of when I think of invisible disability, but I love the way that you've talked about it. That just, adds to my understanding of what all this is. And to wrap up, I want to ask you what neurodiversity means to you. It means different things to different people, so I want to get your perspective on that.
It's just a different way of looking at the world, or a set of frameworks that is atypical. Any kind of difference from the standard capitalist, neoliberal, socialized framework that we have, the way that we're raised. Anything that's different from the way that we're raised can be part of neurodiversity, I think.
Cool.
As well as chemical changes, I think.
Okay.
ADHD or even with depression, a lot of people will, or bipolar. It's a shifting sort of spectrum of.
So I think that's a great definition, but I'm wondering, based on that, whether you would say that there's a difference between mental health challenges and neurodiversity.
Yes, actually. Well, part of something that I've been reading recently about psychology is sort of the myth of mental illness, that a lot of people are really just struggling to figure out how to live properly, quote unquote, properly, and be able to look after themselves in the way that they need to, because of either what they've been told or the way they grew up and things. So I think that aspect of the CBT, how do I live properly? How do I maximize my feeling of happiness? And then there is the more chronic versions of depression, anxiety that overlap with that neurodiversity, I think, quite a lot.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fascinating take on it, and I love that. And I think that I would agree that there's mental health that sits outside of neurodiversity for sure. And it's always interesting to hear people's take on where the line is drawn between mental health and neurodiversity. I think classically it's autism, ADHD, and dyslexia and dyscalculia, and that's it. And then I've, in my own life, has like drawn a new line where we have the Corpus Callosum Disorder community included in that. And I'm always interested to hear people's interpretation of mental health, where they include other experiences under neurodiversity. And I think it's something that has multiple interpretations, and I'm always interested to hear that, because we have such a need for an expanded understanding of how to overcome mental health challenges, and the neurodiversity community has so much to offer, I think, personally.
Even as a pioneering species, so to speak, we, for depression and anxiety, the more generalizable mental health issues, I think there's a lot of moralizing that goes on with them as well. So if we can prove and point that the differences in the brain make people different, shocker, then I think we'd be better off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a key thing for me about what the neurodiversity movement offers, as well as the social model of disability, whether those two things are separate or not, I'm happy to put them into one group, and happy for people who want to separate neurodiversity from disability. It's about other ways of living, environmental change. It's about taking away from the person who has the challenge this idea that there's something medically wrong with them and we can exclude them, but rather the way that we overcome their challenges is by optimizing their environment for them to thrive. Like, everyone needs a safe and suitable environment for them to grow, to work, to live in, and that's in the workplace, the school system, all that sort of stuff. And if we have individualized and adapted workspaces, spaces in schools for people who are neurodiverse, it has this benefit for other people that are perhaps struggling with the typical way of doing things that might not have
need to embrace
autism.
their weird.
I think there's a bit of universal design in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all on a spectrum of normal human behavior, normal human, the human condition, as it were. And I think we're all somewhere on that continuum. And a high tide raises all ships, essentially. Any improvement we can make in one area is an improvement for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, I think that's a great note to finish on. So thank you so much for spending this time with me and giving me a lot to think about and sharing your experiences.